Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 true disturbing stories from the Appalachian Mountains. These are tales of people who ventured into those ancient ridges and hollows and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The cabin my Uncle Tobias left me sat about 40 minutes outside Cherokee, North Carolina, tucked into a fold of land where 2 ridgelines came together. I'd only been there twice as a kid, both times in summer when the woods felt manageable, almost friendly. But when I inherited it that October, the place had been sitting empty for 3 years. The lawyer said I needed to either claim it or let the county take it for back taxes. I figured I'd spend a long weekend cleaning it out, maybe see if it was worth keeping. The drive up felt longer than I remembered. The paved road gave out to gravel, then to something that was barely more than 2 tire ruts with grass growing between them. My Civic bottomed out twice before I reached the clearing. The cabin looked smaller than in my memory, just one room with a sleeping loft, logs gone dark with age. The porch sagged on the left side. I parked and sat there for a minute, with the engine still running. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30, and the light was already going thin and gray. The trees pressed in close on 3 sides. Behind the cabin, the ridge rose steep enough that I couldn't see the top. I told myself I was being stupid. It was just a building, just some trees. Inside smelled like mouse droppings and mildew. I spent the first hour opening windows that didn't want to open, sweeping out leaves and spiderwebs. My uncle's old furniture was still there. A table, 2 chairs, a cot with the mattress gone gray and spotted. I found a Coleman stove under the sink that still had fuel. By the time I got my sleeping bag set up in the loft, it was getting dark fast. I made ramen on the stove and ate it sitting on the porch steps, looking out at the trees. That's when I noticed the scratches. 4 deep gouges in the porch post right next to where I was sitting, running vertically down the wood. They looked fresh. The exposed wood was still pale, not weathered. I touched them and felt how deep they went, at least half an inch into the post. I tried to tell myself it was a bear. We had black bears all through these mountains, but the marks were too deliberate, too evenly spaced, and they were higher than my head when I stood up. The sound started around 9 o'clock. I was in the loft, reading on my phone to avoid thinking about how dark it was outside, when I heard something moving through the leaves behind the cabin. Not walking, dragging. Like something heavy being pulled over the ground. It would go for a few seconds, then stop, then start again. I turned off my phone and listened. The dragging sound came closer, then seemed to circle around the side of the cabin. I could track it by the sound, steady, methodical. Whatever it was moved along the entire perimeter of the clearing, just inside the tree line. Then it stopped. I waited there in the dark, holding my breath. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. After maybe 5 minutes of nothing, I convinced myself it was gone. Maybe it was a deer dragging a broken leg. Maybe it was something sliding over the leaves that just sounded like dragging. That's when something hit the side of the cabin, not a knock. An impact hard enough that I felt it through the floor joists. Then another one lower down, then another on a different wall. Like something was walking around the cabin, striking it at intervals. The blows were too forceful to be hands. They sounded like something heavy being swung against the logs. I stayed frozen in the loft, not even reaching for my phone. The impacts continued, irregular but constant. Sometimes 2 in a row, sometimes a long pause between them. They went on for what felt like an hour but was probably 20 minutes. Then they stopped, and I heard the dragging sound again, moving away this time, back into the woods behind the cabin. I didn't sleep. I sat in the loft with my back against the wall, watching the square of darkness where the window was. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something else, a voice, calling my name. It sounded exactly like my mother, her voice carrying through the trees. "Daniel, Daniel, where are you?" My mother had been dead for 6 years. The voice came from different directions, sometimes behind the cabin, sometimes off to the left. Always that same plaintive tone, like she was looking for me. I put my hands over my ears, but I could still hear it. The worst part was how much I wanted to answer. Some stupid part of my brain that heard my mother calling and wanted to call back. When dawn finally came, I climbed down from the loft. Everything looked normal in the gray morning light. The stove, the table, the open windows. I stepped out onto the porch and saw them immediately. Footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Bare footprints, human-shaped but too long, maybe 14 inches from heel to toe. They circled the entire building, sometimes overlapping where the thing had passed the same spot multiple times. In a few places, the toes had dug in deep, like it had been standing on its toes to reach something high. I followed them with my eyes to where they led back into the woods. Then I went inside, grabbed my keys and sleeping bag and left. I didn't pack anything else. I just walked to my car and drove. The prints were the thing that convinced me I hadn't imagined it. I still have the photos on my phone. I took 3 before I left. When I got home, I looked at them for a long time. In one shot, you can see where the prints stop next to a tree. There's a mark on the bark about 7 feet up, a smear of something dark that I didn't notice when I was there. I signed the cabin over to the county 2 weeks later, told them I didn't want it. The clerk seemed relieved, like she'd been expecting that. She said something about how the property had been in my uncle's family for generations, but nobody ever stayed there long. I didn't ask her what she meant. I still think about that voice sometimes, how it knew my name, how perfectly it sounded like my mother. And I wonder if I'd answered, if I'd called back or opened the door, what would have happened? Part of me is glad I'll never know. The other part can't stop thinking about those footprints, circling the cabin all night while I sat inside in the dark. A story 2. My cousin Helena wanted to hike the Laurel Thicket Trail because she'd read about it in some backpacking forum. Supposedly hardly anyone used it anymore, which meant you could camp right on the trail without seeing another person for days. We'd been planning it since spring, 3 nights, 4 days, deep in the mountains, along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. We started the hike around noon on a Thursday in late September. The weather was perfect, cool enough that you didn't sweat through your shirt in the first mile, but warm enough that the nights wouldn't be brutal. The trailhead was just a gap in the trees with a faded wooden marker that said LT carved into it. No parking lot, no information board, just that marker and the trail disappearing into the woods. The first day was easy. The path was clear enough, mostly following a creek that ran cold and fast over gray stones. We made good time, stopped for lunch by a waterfall where the air tasted like minerals and moss. Helena was in a good mood, singing bits of songs while she hiked. I was happy just to be away from my phone, from work, from everything. We found a flat spot about 6 miles in and set up camp while we still had daylight. Made dinner on Helena's camp stove, freeze-dried stroganoff that tasted better than it had any right to. We were sitting by our fire, not talking much, just comfortable, when Helena pointed at something across the creek. "What's that?" I looked where she was pointing. Across the water, maybe 30 yards into the trees, something pale was hanging from a branch. At first I thought it was a plastic bag, trash someone had left behind, but it was moving slightly in the breeze and the shape was wrong. I got my headlamp and shined it across. The thing hanging there was a shirt, a white button-down dress shirt, the kind someone might wear to an office. It was tied to the branch by one sleeve, the rest of it hanging down. The fabric looked clean, almost new. "That's weird," Helena said. "Who hikes in a dress shirt?" I didn't have an answer. We stared at it for a while, then decided it wasn't our problem. People left weird stuff in the woods all the time. Maybe someone had used it to mark something. Maybe it was a joke, but I kept thinking about how clean it looked, how deliberately it had been tied there. The next morning, we packed up and kept hiking. The trail got rougher, more overgrown, harder to follow in places. We had to consult Helena's GPS a few times to make sure we were still en route. Around mid-afternoon, we came to a section where the path ran alongside a steep drop-off. Not quite a cliff, but close, maybe a 40-foot slope covered in loose rocks and dead leaves falling away to more trees below. That's where we found the boot. Just one boot sitting in the middle of the trail. A hiking boot, brown leather, well worn. Helena picked it up and turned it over. The laces were still tied. The boot print was a size 11 or 12, bigger than either of ours. Inside, the insole had a dark stain that might have been dirt or might have been something else. Someone lost a boot, Helena said, but she didn't sound convinced. How do you lose one boot? I asked. And why is it sitting right in the middle of the trail? She didn't answer. She set it down carefully off to the side of the path and we kept walking. But I noticed she kept looking back over her shoulder. We covered another 3 miles before we started looking for a place to camp. The trail had climbed higher and the trees were different here, shorter, more twisted. There was less undergrowth, so you could see farther between the trunks. The light was starting to fade when we found a relatively flat spot and decided to stop. While Helena set up the tent, I gathered wood for a fire. That's when I saw the second shirt. This one was gray, a t-shirt, hanging from a sapling about 50 feet from our campsite. Same as before, tied by one sleeve, the rest hanging down. I walked over to it. The fabric was damp, like it had been there through rain. When I touched it, my fingers came away smelling like rot. I didn't tell Helena about it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare her. Maybe I was trying not to scare myself. We ate dinner as the last light drained from the sky. The woods were quiet, no birds, no insects, none of the usual forest sounds. Just the occasional pop from our fire and the sound of us chewing. Do you think we should head back tomorrow? Helena asked suddenly. I looked at her. Why? I don't know. This place feels wrong, like we're somewhere we shouldn't be. I wanted to argue with her, to say she was being paranoid, but I felt it too, that sense of wrongness, like the air itself was holding its breath. Let's see how we feel in the morning, I said. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps, not walking on the trail, walking around our tent. Slow, measured steps circling us. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. The steps were too heavy to be an animal, too deliberate. Next to me, Helena was awake too. I could tell by her breathing. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. We could see a shadow through the fabric, something standing there, tall and perfectly still. My hand found Helena's in the dark and squeezed. The shadow stayed motionless for what felt like 10 minutes. Then it moved on, the footsteps resuming their slow circle around us. This went on until dawn, walking, stopping, walking. Sometimes the shadow would press against the tent fabric from outside, making it bow inward. Once, something dragged across the roof of the tent with a sound like fingernails on fabric. When morning light finally came, the sound stopped. Helena and I lay there for another hour before either of us moved. When we finally crawled out, there was nothing. No footprints, no signs anything had been there. But tied to a tree right next to where we'd slept, there was another shirt. This one was pink, a woman's blouse. The sleeves were shredded like something had clawed through them. We packed in silence and started hiking back the way we'd come. Neither of us suggested continuing forward. We covered the 6 miles back to the trailhead in 4 hours, barely stopping. Every time I looked back, I expected to see something following us. I never did. But the feeling of being watched never left. When we got to my car, Helena stopped and turned to look back at the trailhead. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Hanging from the LT trail marker was a shirt, my shirt, the blue flannel I'd worn yesterday and packed in my bag that morning. I'd watched Helena stuff it into my backpack. The sleeves were tied around the wooden post in a neat bow. We got in the car and drove. I didn't stop until we were out of the mountains, and I didn't go back for the shirt. It's probably still there, hanging from that marker, waiting for whoever comes next. Story 3. I'd been working for the Forestry Service for about 8 months when they sent me to check on a fire tower north of Shenandoah. The tower had been automated for years, just a solar-powered camera system that fed back to the main office, but the feed had gone dark 3 days ago. My supervisor figured it was probably just a blown panel or a critter that chewed through a wire. He handed me the keys, gave me directions, and told me to take the service truck. The access road was overgrown, branches scraping both sides of the truck. I drove for about an hour, climbing higher into the hills until the road just ended at a small clearing. The fire tower rose above the trees, a steel skeleton maybe 80 feet tall with a small cabin at the top. The thing looked ancient, rust stains running down the legs, the stairs spiraling up like a metal ribbon. I sat in the truck for a minute, eating a sandwich and looking at the tower. Something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was how isolated it felt, or how the trees around the clearing were all dead, gray standing trunks with no bark, no branches below the canopy. The whole place had that hollow quiet you sometimes get in the mountains, like the forest is holding its breath. I grabbed my toolkit and started climbing. The stairs were solid enough, though they groaned under my weight. Halfway up, I stopped to catch my breath and looked out over the canopy. Nothing but trees in every direction, rolling away in waves of green and gray. No roads, no buildings, no sign humans had ever been here except for this tower. The cabin at the top was about 10 feet square, windows on all sides, and a door with a padlock. The lock was corroded, but it still worked. Inside smelled like hot metal and old wood. The camera system was mounted in one corner, its solar battery blinking red. I set down my toolkit and went to check it. That's when I noticed the marks on the floor. Someone had carved symbols into the wooden boards, shallow scratches that formed patterns I didn't recognize. They weren't letters or numbers, just geometric shapes that spiraled out from the center of the room. The wood around them looked old, like the carvings had been there for years. I tried to tell myself it was just bored forest workers, people who'd been stuck up here with nothing to do. But the patterns made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long, like they were moving even though I knew they weren't. The camera system was fine. The problem was the solar panel. I could see through the window that it had been turned to face away from the sun, pointing down at the trees instead. Simple fix. I just have to climb onto the roof and adjust it. The ladder to the roof was a rusty thing bolted to the outside wall. I climbed up carefully, trying not to think about the drop. The panel was at the peak of the roof, a black rectangle crusted with pollen and dead leaves. I was reaching for it when I looked down and saw what was in the trees below. There were platforms built between the dead trees. Not nice platforms, crude ones, made from branches and what looked like wire. They formed a circle around the clearing, maybe 12 or 15 of them, all at the same height, about 40 feet up. On each platform was a pile of something dark. From where I stood, I couldn't tell what they were. I finished adjusting the panel faster than I should have, not being careful anymore, just wanting to be done. Back inside the cabin, I radioed my supervisor. Got nothing but static. I tried my cell phone, no signal, which wasn't surprising this deep in. That's when I heard the sound. It came from below, from somewhere in the clearing. A rhythmic tapping like wood on wood. Slow at first, then faster. Then more tapping joined in, coming from different directions, until it sounded like dozens of people knocking on trees all around the tower. I went to the windows and looked down. I couldn't see anyone, just those dead trees and the platforms between them, but the tapping continued, echoing off the hills. Then it stopped and I heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was climbing the tower. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, taking one step every few seconds. I could hear the metal stairs creaking under weight. I went to the door and looked down the spiral. I couldn't see who or what was climbing. The angle was wrong, and they were still too far below. I locked the door. It was a flimsy lock, just a hook latch, but it made me feel better. The footsteps kept coming, getting closer. I backed away from the door and looked around for something to use as a weapon. There was nothing but my toolkit. I grabbed the biggest wrench I had. The footsteps reached the landing outside. I could see a shadow move across the gap under the door. Then silence. Whatever was out, they just stood there, not moving, not making a sound. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me standing in the middle of the cabin with a wrench, it standing outside the door. Could have been minutes, could have been an hour. Time felt wrong, like it was stretching and compressing at the same time. Then I heard more footsteps. coming up the stairs, multiple sets all climbing at that same slow, measured pace. The metal groaned under the weight of several bodies. The first one reached the landing and joined the other, then another, then another. I could hear them out there, standing so close together that the landing shouldn't have had room. But they kept coming, kept climbing, kept gathering outside that door. When the door handle started to turn, I climbed out the window. There was a maintenance platform that ran around the outside of the cabin, just a narrow catwalk with a railing. I squeezed through the window and started working my way around to the side where the ladder was. Behind me, I heard the door open. Heard something enter the cabin. I didn't look back. I got to the ladder and climbed down as fast as I dared, my hands slipping on the rusty metal. Above me, I heard them coming out onto the platform. The whole tower was swaying slightly from their movement. I dropped the last 10 feet and hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt. Then I ran for the truck. I could hear them on the stairs above me, descending now, coming down just as slowly and deliberately as they'd gone up. I got the truck started and drove out of there, branches scraping both sides, not caring what I hit. In my rearview mirror, I caught one glimpse of them emerging from the tree line into the clearing. They were tall, too tall, and they moved wrong, like their joints bent in too many places. When I got back to the office, I told my supervisor the camera was fixed, but I wasn't going back. He asked why. I told him about the platforms, about the symbols on the floor, about what I'd heard on the stairs. He listened with this expression like he was waiting for me to finish, and when I did, he just nodded and said they'd send someone else next time it needed maintenance. The way he said it, like he knew, like he'd expected this. I quit 2 weeks later, found a job closer to the city, something that didn't involve isolated towers or long drives into empty forest. But I still think about those platforms sometimes. About the piles on each one and how they were positioned in a perfect circle around the tower. And I think about the symbols carved into that floor and wonder how long they'd been there. Wonder if whoever carved them is still there, standing on that landing, waiting for the next person to climb those stairs. The story 4. My brother Garrett and I inherited a hunting cabin from our grandfather in eastern Kentucky. The old man had died in March, and by the time the estate was settled, it was late October, prime deer season. Garrett called me up and said we should go open the place up, see if it was worth keeping, maybe get some hunting in while we were there. I'd been to the cabin twice when I was a kid, both times with my grandfather. The place was way back in a hollow off Route 460, accessible only by a Forest Service road that barely qualified as a road. The cabin sat in a saddle between two hills, surrounded by old-growth oak and hickory. My grandfather had bought the land in the 60s from a family that was moving away. He told me once that the previous owners had been glad to sell, though he never said why. We drove up on a Friday afternoon. The leaves were at peak color, brilliant reds and oranges that seemed to glow in the slanted light. The cabin looked exactly like I remembered, a single-story log structure with a green tin roof and a stone chimney. The porch ran along the front, 2 rocking chairs sitting exactly where they'd been 20 years ago. Inside smelled like dust and mouse nests. We spent an hour opening windows and sweeping. Garrett got the water pump working while I cleared out the chimney and got a fire going. By the time the sun set, the place felt almost comfortable. We cooked steaks on the old cast-iron stove and drank the beers we'd brought, talking about whether to sell the place or keep it. That's when Garrett found the journal. It was in a drawer of the old desk in the corner, underneath some topographic maps. A composition notebook with a black cover, the pages yellowed and brittle. My grandfather's handwriting inside dated entries going back to 1967. Most of it was mundane, deer he'd seen, repairs he'd made, weather observations. But as Garrett flipped through, we found other entries. Stranger ones. November 12, 1973. Heard them again last night. 3 distinct calls from different directions. Marcus says I should quit coming up here. October 8, 1978. Found another arrangement in the woods behind the cabin. Stones this time, not sticks. I scattered them, but they were back the next morning. September 4, 1981. It followed me to the truck. Didn't see it directly, but I could hear it moving parallel to the path. Counted 5 footsteps for every 2 of mine. The entries went on like that, scattered through years of normal observations. The last entry was from October 2002, 6 months before my grandfather stopped coming to the cabin altogether. I think they know I'm not welcome anymore. The rules have changed. What was tolerated before is not tolerated now. I won't come back. Garrett closed the journal and we sat there, not saying anything. Outside, the woods had gone completely quiet. No insects, no owls, nothing. He was old, Garrett said finally. Probably just paranoid. I wanted to agree, but I remembered something my grandfather had told me when I was 10, the last time I'd been here. We'd been sitting on the porch at dusk, and he pointed at the tree line and said, "Don't go walking in those woods at night, boy. You stay in the cabin after dark, you hear me?" At the time, I'd thought he was just being protective. Now I wondered. We decided to take turns keeping the fire going through the night. Garrett volunteered for first watch. I climbed into one of the bunks and lay there, listening to him moving around the room. The fire crackled. Wind moved through the trees outside. Normal sounds, safe sounds. I must have dozed off because I woke to Garrett shaking my shoulder. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was dark except for his flashlight. "Something's outside," he whispered. I sat up, my heart already racing. "What do you mean?" "Just listen." I listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then I caught it, a scratching sound, like someone dragging a stick along the outside wall of the cabin. It moved from left to right, slowly, deliberately. When it reached the corner, it stopped. Then it started again on the next wall. Garrett and I stood in the middle of the room, not moving, as the scratching sound made its way around the entire cabin. When it completed the circuit, it started again. Same speed, same pressure, same steady dragging sound. "Should we look?" Garrett asked. "No," I said immediately. I don't know why I was so certain, but every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open that door. The scratching continued for maybe an hour. Then it stopped, and we heard footsteps on the porch. Not walking, pacing. Back and forth in front of the door, the boards creaking under weight. Something was out there, moving just on the other side of that thin wooden door. Garrett grabbed the shotgun my grandfather had left in the closet. I didn't stop him. The pacing continued. Back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes it would stop right in front of the door, and we'd see the shadow of something tall blocking the gap at the bottom. Then it would resume pacing. Around 4 in the morning, it finally left. We heard it walk off the porch and into the leaves, footsteps receding into the woods. As soon as it was quiet, Garrett went to the window and looked out. His face went white. "What?" I asked. "Come look at this." I went to the window. The sun was starting to rise, giving just enough light to see the porch. Every board was covered in muddy footprints, dozens of them overlapping, chaotic, but they were all the same foot, walking the same path over and over. A bare foot with toes too long, the heel elongated. In the dirt in front of the cabin, more prints led away into the woods, but there were no prints leading to the cabin. Whatever had been on our porch had come from somewhere above, like it had dropped down from the roof or the trees. We packed in daylight and left, didn't even discuss it. Garrett left the door unlocked, the fire cold in the stove. We just got in his truck and drove. About 2 miles down the Forest Service road, Garrett pulled over and threw up. I'd never seen my brother scared before, not really scared, but his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the steering wheel. "We are selling it," he said. "I don't give a shit what it's worth. We are selling it." I agreed, but here's the thing that bothers me, that I can't stop thinking about. Before we left, I grabbed my grandfather's journal. I've been through it a dozen times since then, and I found something we missed that first night. A passage from June 1969, written 2 years after he bought the place. Talked to old Mrs. Calloway in town today. Asked her about the property. She said her family was happy to see it go. Her grandfather had built the cabin in 1911, but they stopped using it in the 40s. When I asked why, she said, "Some places don't want people." She wouldn't explain further. I keep thinking about that phrase, "some places don't want people," and I think about my grandfather coming to that cabin for decades, following rules he'd figured out through trial and error, rules that eventually changed, rules he couldn't follow anymore. I wonder if whatever was on that porch was giving us a warning, telling us the same thing it told him: "You're not welcome anymore. Leave." We took the hint. The cabin's been sitting empty for months now. We found a real estate agent willing to list it, but nobody's even come to look at it. The agent says she's having trouble finding the place. Her GPS keeps taking her to the wrong hollow. She thinks the address might be wrong. I could correct her. I know exactly how to get there, but I won't. Some places are better left alone. Story 5. I was doing contract work for a telecommunications company, upgrading cell towers in remote areas. The job took me all over West Virginia and Virginia, usually to sites that hadn't been serviced in years. Most of it was routine: climb the tower, swap out equipment, test the signal, leave. Easy money if you didn't mind heights. The tower outside of Bluefield was different from the start. For one thing, there was no service road marked on my GPS. The directions I'd been given ended at an old logging cut, and from there I had to navigate by compass following coordinates. The tower was supposedly 3 miles in on foot. I loaded my gear into a backpack, locked the truck, and started walking. The logging cut had grown over with saplings and briars, making slow going. By the time I found the trail, just a deer path, really, I'd been walking for an hour and was already behind schedule. The trail led down into a steep ravine and then up the other side, following a creek that looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in years. The water was black and still, reflecting the trees like dark glass. I found the tower just after noon. It stood in a small clearing where nothing grew, the ground bare dirt in a perfect circle. The tower itself was old, maybe from the 70s, a lattice construction about 100 feet tall. The equipment shed at the base was a concrete bunker with a steel door. Somebody had painted symbols on the door in red paint. They looked like child's handprints, dozens of them overlapping. I tried the door, locked. I'd been given a code, but it didn't work. After 15 minutes of trying different combinations, I gave up and called my supervisor. No signal. Of course not, that's why I was here. The work I needed to do was at the top of the tower anyway. I could access the shed later. I clipped on my harness, checked my gear, and started climbing. The view from the top was nothing but forest in every direction. I could see mountains rising in waves, covered in trees that hadn't changed much in 1,000 years. No roads, no buildings, nothing human except this tower. The silence was complete, no wind, no birds, nothing. I got to work. Swapped out the old transmitter, ran diagnostics, checked the connections, standard stuff. I was maybe 40 minutes into it when I heard something below, singing. I stopped what I was doing and listened. It was definitely singing, a child's voice, high and clear, singing something that sounded like a nursery rhyme. The words weren't in English, maybe not in any language I recognized, but the tune was cheerful, the kind of thing you'd sing while playing. I looked down through the tower structure. I could see the clearing below, the equipment shed, the beginning of the trail, nothing moving, but the singing continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Hello," I called down. The singing stopped immediately. I waited, gripping the tower rung hard enough that my hands hurt. Nothing, no answer, no movement. After a minute, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Or maybe it was wind in the trees that just sounded like singing. I went back to work. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a tree, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a dress or a robe that hung to the ground. Its head was tilted at an angle, like it was listening or watching. I couldn't see a face. The distance was too great, and the shadows were too deep. "Hey," I shouted. "This is a restricted area." The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, perfectly still, tilted head pointing up at me. I fumbled for my camera and zoomed in. Through the lens, I could see it more clearly. The dress was made of something dark and ragged. The hands, if they were hands, hung too long at its sides, almost to its knees. Where its face should be was just a pale oval, blank and smooth. I took one photo and then it moved. Not walking, it shifted behind the tree in a motion too fast to track, like it had simply appeared in a different location. Now it was closer, at the next tree over, still watching me. I started climbing down. I didn't care about finishing the job, didn't care about my equipment. I just needed to be on the ground, needed to be moving. The figure kept pace with me, shifting from tree to tree as I descended, always staying in my peripheral vision, never quite letting me see it directly. When I was about 30 feet from the ground, it stepped into the clearing. I stopped climbing, my whole body locked up, hands frozen on the rungs. The thing standing in the clearing below me was 7 feet tall at least, maybe more. The ragged dress was actually strips of what looked like bark or cloth, hanging off a frame that was too thin, too angular. Its arms ended in fingers that were just too long, multiple joints bending in ways that made my stomach turn. But the face was the worst part. That pale oval had splits in it, horizontal splits that opened and closed like mouths breathing. 4 of them stacked vertically where a face should be. They opened and closed in sequence, a rippling motion, and with each opening came a sound. That same singing I'd heard before, but fragmented now, coming from all 4 mouths at once in different pitches. It started walking toward the tower, not hurrying, just walking with steps that covered too much ground. I started climbing again, not down but up, back to the top of the tower where maybe I'd be out of reach. The tower began to shake. It was climbing up after me. I could feel the vibrations through the metal, the rhythmic shaking as something heavy pulled itself up the lattice. I climbed faster, my harness catching on rungs, my hands slipping. Below me I could hear it coming, metal creaking, the sound of those 2 long fingers gripping steel. I reached the top and looked down. It was about 60 feet below me and climbing steadily, those multiple mouths still singing, still rippling open and closed. I had nowhere to go. The top of the tower was just a small platform with radio equipment. No escape. Then the singing stopped. The thing stopped climbing. It just hung there on the tower, holding on with one hand and both feet, the other arm hanging loose. Its head tilted back to look up at me, those mouth slits all opening at once in what might have been a smile. Then it started singing again, but different now. The tune was familiar, a song my mother used to sing to me when I was little. The words were wrong, garbled and backwards, but the melody was perfect, and it was singing in her voice. I don't know how long I stayed up there. Long enough that my legs went numb. Long enough that the sun started to sink toward the horizon. The thing hung on the tower below me, sometimes singing, sometimes silent, never moving up or down, just waiting. When the light started to fade, it descended, smooth and quick, dropping down the tower like it was weightless. It stepped off into the clearing, looked up at me one more time and walked back into the trees. I watched until I couldn't see it anymore. I waited another hour before I climbed down. My hands were shaking so bad I almost fell twice. When I reached the ground, I ran. Didn't follow the trail, just crashed through the woods in what I hoped was the direction of my truck. Briars tore my jacket and face. I didn't care, I just ran. I found my truck an hour later, well after dark. Got in, locked the doors and drove out of there. Didn't stop until I hit a gas station in Bluefield with lights and people. I called my supervisor the next morning and told him I was done. Quit over the phone. He tried to talk me out of it, asked what happened. I told him the truth. He listened, didn't say anything for a long time, then told me I'd still get paid for the job even though I didn't finish it. Like he'd heard this before, like he knew. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't the creature, though God knows that was bad enough. It's what I found when I finally looked at the photo I took, the one I took before it started moving. In the photo, the figure is standing behind the tree like I remembered, but there's something else. Right at the edge of the frame, barely visible in the shadows behind it, there are others. 3 or 4 of them at least, maybe more. All the same, tall, thin, those ragged clothes, those stacked mouths. All standing perfectly still, all watching the tower, all watching me. A story 6. My girlfriend Paige and I found the trail by accident. We were camping in the Pisgah National Forest, had set up our tent near a dispersed camping area off the Blue Ridge Parkway. On our second day, we decided to explore a little, maybe find a stream to filter water from. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we came across a path we hadn't seen on any map. It wasn't marked. No trail sign, no blazes on the trees. Just a clear dirt path leading deeper into the woods, well maintained, like it saw regular use. Paige wanted to follow it, see where it led. I wasn't enthusiastic. We only had a few hours before we needed to head back to camp, but she was excited, already walking ahead. The path wound through old trees, oaks and poplars with trunks 3 feet across. The further we went, the quieter it got. Not a peaceful quiet, an absent quiet, like something was missing. It took me a few minutes to realize there were no birds, no insects, nothing making noise except us. "This is beautiful," Paige said, but her voice sounded wrong in that silence. Too loud, too intrusive. We walked for maybe half an hour before we found the structures. They weren't buildings exactly, more like frames, wooden poles stuck in the ground in geometric patterns, connected at the tops with cross beams. Maybe a dozen of them, arranged in a circle in a small clearing off the path. Each frame was about 8 feet tall, just tall enough that you couldn't see what hung from the cross beams until you were right underneath them. Paige walked into the circle before I could stop her. I followed, and that's when I saw what was hanging from the frames. Dolls. Hundreds of dolls, suspended from the beams on wires. Old dolls, the kind from the 50s and 60s with porcelain faces and cloth bodies. Some were intact, some missing limbs or heads. They hung at different heights, the wires of varying lengths, so they created a curtain of dolls all around the interior of the circle. The wind, and I hadn't noticed wind before, but there it was, made them sway and twist. Their painted faces rotated, watching us with glass eyes. "What the hell is this?" Paige whispered. I had no idea, some kind of art installation, but who would build something like this in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road? That's when I noticed the dolls were positioned facing inward. Every single one, regardless of how it hung or twisted, had its face pointing toward the center of the circle, toward us. "We should go," I said. Paige was already backing toward the path. We both felt it, that wrongness, that sense that we'd stumbled into something we weren't meant to see. We turned and started walking back the way we'd come. That's when we realized the path had changed. I don't mean we got turned around. I mean the path was different. Where before it had been clear and well-maintained, now it was overgrown, narrow, choked with weeds. The trees on either side were closer together, their branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel. "This isn't right," Paige said. "This isn't the way we came." She was right, but there was only one path. We couldn't have taken a wrong turn. There hadn't been any turns to take. We started walking anyway, faster now. The path wound through the trees, taking turns that seemed wrong, doubling back on itself. We should have been back to our original trail by now, but nothing looked familiar. Then we came to another clearing. The same clearing. The same frames, the same dolls hanging in their circle, except now they were all facing outward. Every single doll was looking at us as we entered the clearing from the opposite side. Paige grabbed my hand. "We need to run." We did. We ran back down the path, not caring about the branches that whipped our faces, not caring where we were going. The path seemed to go on forever, winding through trees that all looked the same. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like rubber, but I kept running. We burst out into the clearing a third time, but this time the dolls were on the ground, all of them. They'd been cut down and arranged in a spiral pattern leading from the edge of the clearing to the center, where they formed a pile. A cairn of porcelain faces and cloth bodies stacked 3 feet high. And in the center of the pile, sticking up like a flagpole, was Paige's hiking boot. She was wearing both boots. I looked down to confirm it. Both boots laced tight on her feet, but there in the center of the doll pile was an identical boot. Same brand, same color, same wear pattern on the toe. "I want to leave," Paige said, and her voice was shaking. I want to leave right now." We backed away from the clearing, not taking the path this time. We just crashed into the woods in a straight line, pushing through undergrowth, climbing over fallen logs. We didn't stop until Paige's GPS started working again. It had been dead since we entered the path, and we could orient ourselves. We were 2 miles from our camp. It took us an hour to get back, scrambling over rough terrain, not talking, just moving. When we finally saw our tent, I could have cried with relief. We packed up immediately. Didn't even fold the tent properly, just stuffed it in the bag and threw everything in the car. We were pulling out of the dispersed camping area when Paige screamed. She was looking in the side mirror. I looked too. Standing at the edge of the woods, right where the trail we'd found that morning disappeared into the trees, was a figure, tall and thin, dressed in clothes that might have been a dress or might have been strips of cloth. It was too far away to see clearly, but I could see that it was holding something, a small shape dangling from one hand, a doll. We drove back to Asheville and checked into a hotel. Neither of us wanted to talk about it. We just sat in the room with the TV on, lights on, door locked. Around midnight, Paige went to take a shower. She was in there for maybe 5 minutes before she called my name. I went to the bathroom. She was standing in front of the mirror, her back to me, looking over her shoulder at her reflection. There were marks on her back, 3 of them running parallel down her spine. They looked like someone had dragged fingernails down her skin, not deep enough to break the skin, but deep enough to leave red welts. "Did you see anything do this?" I asked. She shook her head. She hadn't felt anything. The marks just appeared. We left the hotel the next morning and drove home to Charlotte. Paige hasn't wanted to go camping since. Neither have I. Sometimes at night, I think about those dolls, about how they changed position each time we entered that clearing. About how they knew we were coming, and I think about that boot in the piles. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe Paige lost a boot on a previous hike, maybe someone found it and left it there as a joke. But we'd never been to that part of North Carolina before. That was our first time in Pisgah. Last week, Paige found something in her jacket pocket, the jacket she'd been wearing that day. It was a small porcelain hand, broken off at the wrist, a doll's hand. She has no idea when it was put there or how long she'd been carrying it around. We threw the jacket away. But I still wonder if something followed us home that day. If somewhere in Charlotte, in our apartment building, in the walls maybe, there's something building its own circle, hanging its own dolls, waiting for us to walk into a clearing we'll never leave. Story 7. I was 23 and working seasonal trail maintenance for the Park Service when they assigned me to Old Campbell Hollow. The hollow was in the remote section of the park, accessible only by a service road that got washed out every spring. My job was to hike in, assess the condition of the trail, and mark any areas that needed repair for the crew coming in the following week. It was supposed to be a 2-day trip: hike in, camp overnight, hike out. Solo work, which I preferred. I'd done maybe a dozen of these assessments at that point. It was easy work if you didn't mind being alone in the woods. I started the hike around 8 in the morning. The trail followed a creek that was still running high from recent rain, the water brown and loud. The trail was in rough shape, trees down, washed out sections, overgrowth that hadn't been cleared in years. I marked problem areas as I went, taking photos and GPS coordinates. Around 3 in the afternoon, I reached the camping area, just a flat spot near the creek with a fire ring someone had built years ago. I set up my tent and spent the rest of the daylight hiking further up the trail to see what condition it was in. The higher I went, the worse it got. Looked like nobody had maintained this trail in a decade, maybe longer. Made me wonder why the Park Service even bothered keeping it open. I got back to camp just as the light was failing. Made dinner on my camp stove, ramen with some dried vegetables mixed in, and sat by the creek listening to the water. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of alone that feels good after spending months dealing with tourists and coworkers. I was getting ready to turn in for the night when I noticed the stones. Someone had stacked stones on the opposite bank of the creek. Not a random pile, a deliberate structure, balanced stones of decreasing size, forming a tower about 2 feet tall. I shined my headlamp on it. The stones were wet, like they'd been placed recently, but I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen any footprints or signs of other campers. I told myself another trail worker had probably passed through earlier. Even though that didn't make sense, I was the only one assigned to this section. I crawled into my tent and tried not to think about it. I woke sometime in the middle of the night to the sound of stones clicking together. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The sound came from outside the tent, close by. Click, 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 like someone was tapping 2 rocks together in a rhythm. It would go for a minute, then stop, then start again. I unzipped the tent and looked out. My headlamp showed the creek, the fire ring, the trees beyond, nothing moving. But the clicking continued, coming from different directions now. Click, 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 sometimes to my left, sometimes behind me, sometimes from across the creek. Then I saw them, more stone towers. At least a dozen of them, arranged in a circle around my camp. They'd been built while I was asleep, each one about 2 feet tall, each one balanced impossibly on stones that should have toppled. They ringed my tent completely. I got out of the tent because I couldn't stand being enclosed anymore. My headlamp swept across the towers. As the light hit each one, the clicking sound came from that direction, like the stones were responding to being seen. I started walking toward the closest tower, thinking I'd knock it over, break whatever weird spell this was. Before I got 3 steps, all the clicking stopped at once. Silence, complete silence. Even the creek had gone quiet. Then I heard footsteps in the creek. Something was wading through the water toward me. I spun around and shined my light at the sound. There was a person standing in the middle of the creek. At least, it looked like a person from a distance. It was the right general shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long and thin, the body too narrow, and it was standing in the creek in a way that made no sense. The water came up to its thighs, but it wasn't struggling against the current, wasn't even swaying. Just standing there, perfectly still, water flowing around it like it was rooted to the creek bed. Its head turned toward me. The movement was smooth, continuous, rotating much further than a human head should be able to turn. When it faced me fully, I realized it had no face, just a blank expanse of pale skin where features should be. It took a step toward the bank. The water didn't splash. Its foot just entered and exited the creek without disturbing the surface. I ran, didn't grab my tent, my gear, nothing. Just ran down the trail the way I'd come, my headlamp bouncing wildly. Behind me, I could hear it following. Not splashing through the creek, not crashing through the woods, just a steady, rhythmic sound like wood on wood. Clack, clack. Clack keeping pace with me. I ran for what felt like hours. My lungs burned and my legs were shaking, but every time I slowed down, I'd hear that clacking sound getting closer. The trail seemed longer than before, winding through sections I didn't remember from the hike in. Trees crowded close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel. I came around a bend and stopped so fast I almost fell. There was my camp, my tent, my fire ring, the stone towers arranged in their circle. I'd run in a complete loop, and standing next to my tent was the thing from the creek. No, not the same one, a different one. This one was shorter, its limbs even more disproportionate, bent at angles that hurt to look at. It cocked its head, that same too-far rotation, and began walking toward me. Behind me, I heard the clacking sound. The first one was coming up the trail. I did the only thing I could think of. I waded into the creek and started following it downstream. The water was cold enough to make my legs ache, but I moved as fast as I could, stumbling over rocks, using my hands to keep balance. I don't know how long I followed that creek, long enough that my headlamp died and I was moving in darkness, guided only by the sound of the water, long enough that I lost feeling in my feet. The clacking sound followed me for a while, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Then eventually it faded. I came out onto the service road around dawn. My truck was there. I'd parked it at the trailhead the day before. I got in, started the engine and drove. Didn't go back for my gear, just left it all. When I got back to the ranger station, I told them I'd had an equipment failure and had to abort the assessment. They asked about my gear. I said I'd lost it crossing the creek. They wrote me up for the loss but didn't press further. I quit 2 weeks later, told them I was going back to school, which was partly true. But mainly I couldn't stand the idea of going back into those woods. Couldn't stand the thought of being alone on a trail, wondering if I'd hear that clicking sound, if I'd see stone towers appearing around my camp. The thing that haunts me most happened about a month after I quit. I was back home, living with my parents while I figured out what to do next. I woke up one morning and went to make coffee. On the kitchen counter, someone had built a small tower of stones. 5 stones balanced perfectly, each one smaller than the last. My parents swore they didn't do it. We didn't even have stones like that in the house. These were creek stones, smooth and gray, the kind you find in streams. I knocked the tower over and threw the stones in the trash. But I think about them sometimes. About how they got into my house. About whether something followed me home from old Campbell Hollow. Something that builds towers and walks through water without making a splash. I moved to a different state 6 months ago. Got an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, far from any forests or streams. But last week, I came home from work and found a single stone on my kitchen counter. A creek stone, smooth and gray. I haven't figured out what it means yet. Whether it's a message or a warning or just a reminder that some things don't forget. That some places don't let go of you, even when you leave. I keep the stone in my pocket now. I don't know why. Maybe because keeping it with me feels safer than leaving it somewhere I can't see it. Or maybe because I'm afraid that if I throw it away, I'll wake up and find 2 stones instead. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.